On page 148 of Negative Dialectics, Adorno says, as an a priori task of thought, a task immanent in thought, identity seems positive and desirable. Now, this is an important statement because if we think about this, there is a psychological appeal that identity has for humans. And this psychological appeal is not merely an impulse of immediacy per se. This psychological appeal exists at a deeper level even, meaning that it's rationally desirable. Now this is very interesting. Not only is identity immediately desirable because it functions at the level of appearance of surface, but when we probe the concept rationally, Aristotelian forms, we find that the concept is appealing rationally as well. As an a priori task of thought, because identity exists at a fundamental level, we can never escape it per se, but we can come to understand its contradictory nature. As an a priori task of thought, a task immanent in thought, identity seems positive and desirable because it seems like it's dividing the world. It is creating determinations of reality that seem to give us some type of power over reality, that make us feel that we are making progress in understanding reality. And that's not to say that identity is completely without value. That's not true at all. That's not the dialectical position. The dialectical position is that we understand the internal architecture of the concept of identity itself. We know that identity essentially ends up negating itself. It contains its own negation. Adorno says identity is the primal form of ideology. I love this quote by him. It's an excellent citation on page 140. Identity is the primal form of ideology, and I think this is absolutely correct. It exists at the foundational level of ideology. That identity is what is utilized within the formation of ideological structures to ultimately deceive people. Identity is what sits at the root. And because of this, because identity sits at the base, you have ideological structures that are not conscious of the fact that identity sits at the base of their ideological structures. And what this means is when we collapse identity, the reason that Hegel is so significant in the history of philosophy is because he collapsed identity on its own terms. He demonstrated a dialectical truth about identity, that identity contains difference within itself. So these ideological structures that have identity at the base, they have not had the capacity to deconstruct the identity that resides at the base of their ideologies. So what we're talking about a massive refutation, sweeping negation of a vast amount of the world's ideology structures. I mean, think about that. We're talking about the negation of a vast amount of these ideological structures. We relish it, identity, says Adorno, as adequacy to the thing it suppresses. So we take it to be a form that we embrace because it helps us to chop off, to knock down complexity, essentially, to create the world, to project the world into a more simple form. Now, these ideological structures that have identity at their base and they're not conscious of it, and this would include the entire branch of conservative ideology. The whole thing is based on simplistic identity logic. Ayn Rand, identity logic. Milton Friedman, identity logic. What happens when this identity is refuted at the axiomatic level is that the entire conservative position, the entire ideological position of so many different modalities is collapsed. Their entire system is collapsed because the axiomatic principle, the crucial point in their ideological structure, collapses and falls, which collapses their entire structure. Now, they don't want to believe that. They'll, of course, fight and push back and demand that identity holds its integrity and that the appearance, the claim it makes for itself, that it is identity without difference, they will claim that this is true. They will push this forward as a truth, demanding that their ideology is founded upon the strongest axiomatic rational principle. But that's not true. When that same rationality that they claim to love is directed at identity itself, the identity implodes. It's destroyed. Adorno says ideology's power of resistance to enlightenment is owed to its complicity with identifying thought, or indeed with thought at large. So ideology's power of resisting enlightenment, I'll say it in a different way, ideology's power of resistance to rationality, to its own refutation, to its collapse, is owed to its complicity with identifying thought. It's engaged in this act, this process of identity that does give it indeed a psychological power over humans. Let's see. Adorno says on page 149 that regression of consciousness is a product of its lack of self-reflection. We can see through the identity principle, but we cannot think without identifying. Any definition is identification. So clearly, Adorno is making the point that he makes often, that there is an inescapable nature to identity, that we're all bound up in it. But the distinction that I always make is that there's a difference between a dialectical identity and a Aristotelian or a ideological, a monological identity. Regression of consciousness, going backwards in consciousness, is a product of its lack of self-reflection. If this is true, that regression of consciousness is a product of its lack of self-reflection, then we kind of have an advantage here in knowing this, because we know that it's important for us to engage in the act of self-reflection. This matters. We need to engage in the act of self-reflection, which could do the opposite of regression. It could engage the primate in a process of progression. progression, progress, moving forward. We can see through the identity principle, there's dialectic, but we cannot think without identifying. There's this interesting ontological reality where identity is indeed bound up in all things. Adorno says, the force that shatters the appearance of identity is the force of thinking. I love this quote. The force that shatters the appearance of identity is the force of thinking. You know, thinking really is a force. It truly is a power. I've tried to articulate this so many times, that thought is indeed a power. It undeceives us. It enlightens us. It gives us the conceptual power to be able to interact and proceed in the world in a way that is more intelligent. And that intelligence, the product of thought, of thinking, of thought, which is intelligence, that intelligence is a power. The force that shatters the appearance of identity. See, because identity appears as all-powerful, as all true, as absolute, as a complete unit within itself. But the reality is that when we analyze this appearance, when dialectic shatters the appearance, the false appearance of identity, that's what the force of dialectical thinking, and we could just say thinking, because that is ultimately what is happening, but we can now call it dialectic, thanks to Hegel. And this has the capacity, this shatters this false appearance of identity. This is very important because as we navigate the world, we're constantly assaulted and confronted with appearance. Appearance is always the thing that deceives us and ends up tripping us up. If a great manipulator intends to manipulate us, they very likely intend to make use of appearance in one form or another, because we make assumptions from appearance. But what thought has the power to do, what dialectic has the power to do, is to peer through this appearance. And Adorno says not to peer through it, but to shatter it. Marcuse has talked about a destructive nature associated with dialectics. A destructive, that they're a form of destruction, they destroy. And I've made this point before in papers. It's precisely the nature of dialectic, that it destroys, it breaks, it negates, it shatters. And in shattering that appearance, it is actually emancipating us from a lie, from being deceived. And what does this emancipation do? It means that we can comprehend the object of reality with far greater accuracy, and that accuracy gives us the capacity or the ability to, it's a power. It's a power in interacting with reality. We could call it even a power of movement through reality. Everything is flowing, everything is moving. There's a sense in which dialectic gives us a power of fluidity. It increases our power of movement and activity through the vehicle of intelligence. Adorno says on page 149, living in the rebuke that the thing is not identical with the concept is the concept's longing to become identical with the thing. You know, one of the reasons that Adorno is so incredibly difficult to read and he stands apart from other thinkers, is because he writes sentences like this, sentences that are paradoxical and that contain layers of negation. I'm not sure what else to call it. There might be a better word for it, but I call it these layers of negation. And the way I think about it is that the average person can do a negation or two negations, but Adorno has multiple negations within his sentences sometimes. Sometimes he'll have a sentence with 3 negations, possibly even 4 negations. It's very, very hard to follow that. That's what makes the thought so difficult. Living in the rebuke that the thing is not identical with the concept is the concept's longing to become identical with the thing. Now, when I read this, it's interesting. The line that pops out to me is the concept's longing. This is so fascinating that our concepts have an ambition, an agenda that presupposed and built into the concept is some type of aim, some type of goal that the concept is essentially seeking to achieve. Living in the rebuke that the thing is not identical with the concept is the concept's longing to become identical with the thing. So we, of course, want our concepts of the things in reality to be as accurate as they can possibly be. But as we analyze our own thinking, we learn that that's not the case. We only essentially know in part. We understand a fraction of the object, the reality that's before us. But we should not despair from this. This is not a situation of despair. In a situation like this, we just come to understand that this is the nature of our reality. And the most important point is that this does not remove the authority of concepts. That's very important. This does not destroy or negate the authority of concepts. So the reality is that our concepts, different concepts have different degrees of authority because of the accuracy of the concept, because of the accurate presuppositions within the concept, the explanatory power of the concept. So different concepts are going to have different degrees of power contained within them. And just because these concepts don't grasp the object in its totality doesn't mean that they lose their authority. That's very important, because in the age of nihilism that we live, you have these moral absolutists, are these cynics and these nihilists. They want to attack everything by saying, prove to me that your idea or concept is 100% certain. Well, this is a loaded standard. It's in no way serious, because everything that this person believes, who is stating this, has not gone through that criteria and can't go through that criteria. But that person is unconscious of the fact that they're wielding this hypocritical, impossible, irrelevant standard. It's not a serious standard. So concepts, just because they don't have an absolute identity with the object, does not mean that they ultimately lose their authority. On page 150, Adorno says that ideas live in the cavities between what things claim to be and what they are. Utopia would be above identity and above contradiction. It would be a togetherness of diversity. I think this is a very important quote, and I'll explain why. It's a nice statement that ideas live in the cavities between what things claim to be and what they are. There's always this reaching, this always trying to grasp the world through linguistics, through the manipulation of the symbol. And it's the symbol, it's very successful. We can have been able to communicate to accomplish amazing things. So the value of the symbol in linguistics should not be negated simply because it once again fails to meet some absolutist, false, absolutist, radical, skeptic standard. That's what the standard that is usually put forward by individuals who try to wield this radical skepticism. Ideas live in the cavities between what things claim to be and what they are. Utopia, now this is where it gets interesting to me, would be above identity and above contradiction. Wow, so Adorno is now talking about concepts that he believes have sublated and transcended both identity and contradiction. And he says that this would be a togetherness of diversity. I think even though Adorno's point is not to expound that, we can still draw out tremendous implications from this. Utopia would be above identity and above contradiction. It would be a togetherness of diversity. So my mind immediately asked the question, what is it about this idea, the concept of togetherness and diversity, or we might say the reality of togetherness and diversity, that elevates it above identity and above contradiction? It would seem to me that Adorno's talking about a very high level of transcendence here. He may in fact be talking about a sublation of dialectic itself. I don't know if he's aware of that by making this statement, but he's talking about something that he says is above identity and above contradiction. It's a material state of being that I suppose the answer to the problem, to the question, is that the material state of being, the reality of the phenomenology within this togetherness of diversity, has essentially transcended the linguistic and the symbolic forms in some way. But is it possible that it actually transcended identity and contradiction? Well, it did transcend identity, because the togetherness and the diversity would imply a dialectical reality, wherein Hegel always talks about the crucial aspect of the unification of oppositions without shattering or destroying the opposition, to polling these oppositions into a higher sublated conceptual consciousness. So here we have utopia would be above identity and above contradiction. So this togetherness of diversity, this concrete phenomenology of existing, it has indeed transcended the idealism or the ideology of identity, because what it's embodying with the togetherness of diversity, it's actually embodying the shattering of the identity form. I want to say the conservative, the regressive identity form. I mean, that's essentially what the identity form is. But the point about being above contradiction, though, so Adorno would have reality contained in the paradox here, within the contradiction. This would mean that utopia is above identity because it transcends the ideological identity form into a dialectical form. And it's also above contradiction because in its diversity, it has still maintained a togetherness. So I think this is probably how Adorno was thinking if we were unpacking this layer of his thought.